Hi, this is Robert with Cruzbike, and today we are going to be assembling the Cruzbike Q45. Alright, let's crack this box open. Everything you need to build a complete bike comes in the box. First thing we're going to do is remove the seat pad, the small parts boxes, and then the main part of the bike will pull right out of the box. Everything's nice and packed together and secure. You have the main frame, the wheels, the handlebars, and the chainstay, and the boom and slider. Here we have our parts box. We have our seat that we took out earlier, as well as our seat cushion and Velcro strips attached. And any accessories you may have purchased will be included in the box as well. Alright, in our parts box, let's crack open that so we can make sure we have everything we're going to need. We have our cable tip and some pedal washers here. We also have our derailleur cables, the main section and the section for down by the derailleur. Have our reflector set. And add those. You can add the reflectors to the handlebar and to the seat post on the back. We have our pedals, some nice platform pedals this time. We also have our rear derailleur. We'll get into the install of that in here in a little bit. And we have our chain, and note that the quick link for the chain is included. It's wrapped up inside the chain, so everything for the chain is in one place. And we have our front through axle. Note the small tool is installed in the end. And we also have our skewers, which are going to be used to install our seat. We also have our seat back bracket. And we have an extra seat back bracket that we are not going to use, so that you can put in the spare parts bin. Alright, now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start undoing zip ties. Take off our handlebars here. Make sure we don't damage the derailleur cable. Then we're going to simply undo all these zip ties and very carefully remove the packaging, removing the wheel. We have our drive wheel with the cassette installed. Could move the back wheel. And before we know it, we'll have all of the packaging removed from our gorgeous new Q45 frame. And once all your packaging is removed, you want to arrange it like this. So we have the front end kind of positioned where we need it, the handlebars, and everything else is attached. Now, also in your box is a Cruzbike toolkit. I have a jar of screw grease here, thread grease. There is a small packet of grease in your toolkit, so you can use that as well to grease some of the threads. First thing we're going to do is get our through axle. Now, note this is for the front fork and chainstay. We're going to remove the tool. You cannot insert the through axle with the tool in the end. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure we put a little bit of grease on the threads and shaft of the through axle. And we don't need a huge amount, just a little bit on the threads, nice thin layer. Again, the small blister pack of grease included with your Cruzbike toolkit will be enough to do all these tasks if you use it sparingly. We're going to set that aside. Now we also have our wheel stand. It's my favorite handy tool. It's like a third hand. So in our wheel stand we can take our drive wheel and we're going to simply park it with the cassette side facing us, or on the right side if the bike is facing to the right. We're going to put our wheel right in the wheel stand like this. We have our through axle at the ready. Now we're simply going to lift up the entire frame. Now note, we have the Viscoset headset here, so the fork is going to feel very stiff. So when you go to turn this, it's going to feel very stiff. That's on purpose. That's the Viscoset headset at work. So you don't want to go adjusting the headset. It's already preset, so don't worry about that. Now we're going to simply lower the fork down onto the wheel. We're going to line up our disc rotor. Now note that the calipers are not completely tightened down yet, so they will move back and forth, which should make it easy for you to get the fork over the wheel. Alright, now I've grabbed our front end, which is partially assembled from the factory. Now I want to make note of the space between these bottom bracket clamps for the chainstay. There's small O-rings between the clamps and the chainstay. That's on purpose. That's to provide a visual gap that you need in order to not over tighten those clamps. Now it's just tight enough from the factory. You should be able to move it a little bit. Use a 4mm Allen if it's not quite snug, because we're going to install the front chainstay over the fork. The derailleur hanger is already installed into the chainstay. So we're going to simply line this up. We're going to get our through axle in through the wheel. Then we're going to use our small tool, which is basically a 6mm Allen. And when everything's lined up, we should be able to easily tighten this through axle. Now we're going to tilt this up at an angle, kind of pointing at the 2 o'clock position, as you can see here. And if we tighten that through axle, it'll stay put. So now we're going to take our 5mm Allens. We have 2 of them in our Cruzbike toolkit, because for the pivot clamp we need both. We need 2 5mm Allens. Now we're going to take this bolt out, and we're going to note the 2 washers are on the sleeve side and they're on the outside. So 2 washers on the outside of the pivot clamp and 1 washer on the bolt side of the pivot clamp. This is very important. The clamp can only tighten onto the boom and slider if there's 2 washers on the sleeve side and 1 washer on the bolt side. So now we're going to move the pivot clamp down about 1/3 of the way or so down the slider. We're going to use our 5mm Allen to loosen the boom clamp, which I'm doing there. Then we're going to simply extend this a little bit. Once everything is assembled, you're going to do a final fit later to the bike, but we just want to get it somewhat close for appearances now. Now we have to check the second part of the pivot clamp, the part that's attached to the steer tube. If it is not square with the fork axle, we're going to want to use our 5mm Allen to loosen the 2 bolts on the side and turn it. We just want to twist it enough so that it's nice and lined up. We can just sight right down it, and we can make sure everything is nice and square, so that way when the top of the pivot clamp is over it, the sides line up and the holes line up, so that way we can get the sleeve bolt through easily. Now we're going to want to make sure we put a little grease on the sleeve bolt, so it'll make life much easier getting this in and out later if you need to disassemble it. So once we have some grease on there, we're going to slide the sleeve side with the 2 washers on the outside into the pivot clamp. And then we have our other threaded end with 1 washer on the outside. And then we're going to use our 2 5mm Allens to tighten this down. Now we don't have to snug it down super tight for now, because we have to do a fit later. So we just want to tighten it down just to keep everything put while we do our assembly. You can also use this opportunity to make sure our handlebar clamp is nice and level before we do a final snug down. If you loosened the lower part of the pivot clamp, make sure you tighten the 2 bolts on that side as well. Make sure those are nice and snug. And then we're also going to snug down our boom clamp here just a little bit. This clamp, you always want it to be flush with the end of the tube. And now we can move on to the back wheel. So the rear through axle is already installed in the frame. So we're going to use our through axle tool to loosen this. And that should unthread and come right out. And we can put a little bit of grease on this through axle. And the back wheel will slide right in. Now remember, just like the front, the caliper moves a little bit. It's not quite lined up and tightened. That's going to be a step we do later in assembly. But we're going to line up the calipers and get that rotor between there, and then that wheel should slide right down into the dropouts, and then the through axle will insert. We put a little bit of grease on those threads, little bit of grease on the through axle, and we can slide that in and use our tool to tighten it. Then once we're done with this tool, we can stash it right in the end of the axle on the other side. It works either in the front or the rear. Alright, let's install the handlebars. So the handlebars go with the drops facing forward. The brake levers will be facing forward. We're going to use our 4mm Allen wrench to loosen the handlebar clamp screws. We're going to remove these screws all the way. Keep everything in hand. Again, you want to put a little bit of thread grease on these screws. Make it nice and easy to get them in and out. Once we have the clamps loose, we're going to place our handlebars in the clamp. This is a 31/8 clamp, so other 31/8 bars will work if you want to experiment. But for the stock setup, we're going to simply insert our handlebar clamp screws and use our 4mm Allen to tighten them back up. Now, just like the chainstay clamp screws, you want to have a gap top and bottom. There should be an even gap there, and you should be able to center that Cruzbike mark right between them. Make sure they're nice and centered. Alright, now we're going to undo our brake cables. They're pre-installed, but they're snug on the calipers. But for the moment, we're just going to undo, and we're going to pass them under the pivot clamp right here. The rear cable will go to the right lever, and the front cable will go to the left lever. So once we have figured out which one's which, we can rest that front brake over here and the rear brake on the right side. And now we can line up our slot in our adjusters, and we're going to use our 5mm Allen to loosen the cable on the caliper. It's not very tight. It's not meant to be. It's just for packing to keep everything nice and secure. So they're just going to undo that, and then will allow us to pull just a little bit of cable out of the housing, and we can insert the cable end into the brake lever, and then simply route this cable down and into and through the threaded adjuster. We just need it hand tight there for now. Now that adjuster only takes up the compression of the housing. It does not really adjust the cable. Okay, after we've repeated that for the rear, we're going to move to the derailleur. So first thing we want to make sure is that the little washer for the derailleur is in the right position for the B-limit screw. It should look like this. If it's pivoted around like this, it is incorrect. So you want to make sure that the tab is against the screw, like that. And then that way, that little tab is going to sit up against the back side of the derailleur hanger, right there. So once we make sure that washer is in the right position, we'll use our 5mm Allen to install the rear derailleur onto the derailleur hanger, making sure it's nice and secure. We'll use our 4mm Allen to undo the cable clamp screw, the little pinch screw at the back. Okay, now before we do anything else, we need to check our jockey wheel alignment with the cassette. So we have two screws here, a lower limit and an upper limit screw. So we have a low and a high, and they'll have a little L and a little H. H is for the small cog, L is for the big cog. Now these are very critical adjustment to do and to check. We want to make sure that the jockey wheel lines up. If you look straight down, and we want it to line up exactly in line with the small cog. If it doesn't, we're going to use our 3mm Allen in our adjustment screws. The high one will adjust the derailleur at the small cog. So here, if I turn this, you will see the jockey wheel moving back and forth to either be in line with the small cog or out of line. So here, if I turn it, it will not let the derailleur go down all the way. So we want to make sure it's lined up. So I'm going to adjust this. We want to make this as absolutely straight as possible, because this is our very, very first position on our indexing. If we get this right, our indexing should work pretty well right out of the gate. Now we're going to pull the cage forward, and we're going to push the derailleur all the way in to make sure that we're not going past the large cog. We want to go all the way to the large cog, but we don't want to go past it, because we don't want the chain to overshift this gear and go into the spokes. So that's the other limit screw. So we want that limit screw to stop the derailleur at the very point at which the cogs line up with the biggest cog on the cassette. Now note, you have to pull the cage forward in order to check this. So if we make an adjustment, we got to pull the cage forward and then push the derailleur in to see. Got to go a little more, so we're not quite there yet. There we go. We can check that alignment. We want it to go right up to the point where those teeth line up and don't go past. And the reason why we have to pull the cage back is because the tension of the chain is going to be pulling that cage all the way up like this. If we simply try to push the derailleur in without moving the cage, it's going to hit. But when there's a chain on it, it's going to be taking up slack, so it's going to be pulled forward. So it's important to make this adjustment with the cage extended. And once we have that set, we have our low and high limit screws adjusted. And we're ready to route our cables. Alright, so we've installed our upper section of derailleur housing into the cable stop, and now our lower section is going to go on the little small section here. Kind of go up into the cable stop of the fork, and then we're going to route the cable down into the derailleur. It's a straight shot on this one, nice and easy. And insert the end of that cable in there. Now we're going to make sure our pulling on this cable, we shift all the way down into the highest gear. So there's no shifts up into the shifter. We want all the cable to be pulled out. Then we're going to simply route our cable into the tab. There's a little notch you can see there. We're going to make sure that cable is routed in the notch. We're going to pull it a little bit and give it a little bit of tension. And then we're going to tighten down our pinch bolt with the 4mm Allen. Once we've done that, we can trim our cable and install the small cable crimp on the end with a pair of pliers. After your cable is installed, you can check by doing some shifts and watching that derailleur shift up. With each indexed click, it should line up with the next cog. There is a small barrel adjuster at the top of the shifter if you need to make small adjustments. Alright, so now let's line up our brake calipers. So it's a T25 Torx bit, which conveniently is also part of our through axle tool. So you can use this, or you can use a longer kind of screwdriver style T25. If you don't have one, then you can use the through axle tool, works just fine. We're also going to have handy our 5mm Allen in order to adjust the cable pinch bolt. Alright, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that the caliper is centered over the rotor. So the easiest way to do this is to be able to look up in between the pads and the rotor and then tighten our T25 bolts into the frame. You can have a friend kind of hold the back end of the bike up, or you can lean over. I like to use a pair of glasses with a small flashlight attached, some little dental type glasses to look up in there. But when those pads are centered over the rotor with a small gap on each side, we should be able to tighten down these bolts, and then we should have a freewheeling wheel. Now when you do this, make sure you watch your fingers because that rotor is sharp. If you hear rubbing, do a double check and see which pad the rotor is rubbing on. Also make sure your rotor is true. If it's not, there are rotor truing tools that you can buy, or you can use a crescent wrench to do that. But once that is there, then we're going to add some pre-tension to our cable, and then we're going to give it a test. We're going to feel what that's like with our lever, make sure our travel is good. If you have any questions on adjusting disc brakes, there are some great Park Tools YouTubes on adjusting disc brakes. These ones are not too hard to set up from the factory. A pretty good adjustment. Alright, now we're going to do the same thing for the front. This one's a little easier because we can look right down from above and see the gap between the rotor and the pads. And once we are satisfied with our gap, we might have to hold this caliper. Try not to get your finger oil on the rotor. We want to keep the rotor clean. And once we have a nice gap, we're going to tighten down this caliper centered over the rotor as well, and then use our 5mm Allen to put a little bit of pre-tension on that cable and tighten that pinch bolt. Now these are just preliminary adjustments here, so you always want to make sure you do a really good fine-tune of your shifting and your brakes before you do an official ride. If you have any questions or you're not familiar with adjusting bike brakes or bike derailleurs, I highly recommend trying to get a final tune and adjust done at a local bike shop near you. Alright, once we're done with those adjustments, our little tool will store right back into our through axle. Alright, let's move on to the seat installation and the rear seat post. Alright, so we have our two front seat mounts for the base, And we also have our seat post clamp and our seat post. We always want to make sure we have enough insertion to go past the small hole for the clamping. More is always better in my opinion, so we want to make sure that we have a good amount of insertion of the tube. Then we can line this up, make sure everything's nice and lined up. Not a problem if it's not later, because we can always loosen the clamp and adjust our seat post. Now we're going to take our skewers and our seat back bracket. Going to have that handy. Alright, we're going to install one quick release lever in the front and a second in the back tube with the springs. And now we're going to take one of our skewers. They're all the same, so it doesn't matter which one. We're going to remove the springs. And the one that has no springs we're going to use to install the seat back bracket. Now we don't need the springs on here because there's no recess for the springs to go into. So if you leave the springs on, they're just going to get crushed. So on this skewer, it's better to leave the springs off. And then the final quick release with springs, we're going to put in the front part of the seat back U bracket. Now we have our seat. Our fine folks have pre-assembled the seat for us. We have our brackets installed here. Now the preset position for the seat base is kind of in the middle with the brackets towards the front. And those are simply going to go right down over the top of the frame like this. And once we have those brackets all the way down on top of those mounts, then we can tighten down our skewers. And we want to make sure those skewers are nice and secure. Then the seat back bracket is simply going to swing back and install either in the top or the bottom. I'm going to install mine here in the top just so you can see, or in the bottom. Now depending on if you have a rear rack and you need clearance for something like a rear rack from the top of the seat tube, then you can do more insertion into the frame. Or if you don't, then you can have it in the top part. Now the other thing we're going to want to do, since our brackets are installed at the forward position, is if you have pressure on the seat clamp here, we're going to want to take this clamp and we're going to rotate it so the clamp is on the bottom. Now if you have your seat base clamps installed in the more rearward holes, which would effectively move the seat forward, then you do not need to do that step. Now once we have everything set here, we can tighten our quick release levers on the seat base and the seat back and the seat tube, and also the shock quick release lever. You want to make sure all of these attachments are secure and tight. Alright, now let's install some pedals. So we have our platform pedals here with a little grease on the threads. These ones have flats, or you can use a 6mm Allen to tighten them. You have both tools in your Cruzbike toolkit. One thing to note is if you look on the inside, you will be able to tell which pedal goes on the right and which pedal goes on the left. So if we look in here, we see a nice little raised L. So that's our left pedal. And this one should have an R on it, and that's our right pedal. So it's the position is if you are sitting on the bike, so right goes on the right side here, and left goes on the left. On pedals, if you are back pedaling, you should be able to tighten the pedal. So back pedal the right to install, and then same thing on the left, back pedal to install the left. And once you have hand tightened the pedals into the cranks, then you use your 15mm wrench, or in this case a 6mm Allen, to do a kind of final snug of the pedals onto the cranks. And give that a nice snug. And same thing with our right pedal. Give it a really good snug down. Alright, let's move on to the chain. We're going to have our quick link here, and we're going to remove it with our clippers from the zip tie. Keep it handy. We're going to take the chain and drape it right over the cassette on the small cog, and then we're going to drape it over the chain ring. Now note, this is a narrow wide chain ring, which means some of the teeth are skinny and some of the teeth are wide, so the chain only fits one way on the chain ring itself. That's to help keep the chain on the chain ring. Now we're going to take the chain, and we're still on the small cog, and we're going to drape it right over the top of the top jockey wheel of the rear derailleur. Now once we've done that, we're going to pull the cage forward, and we're going to pass the chain down over the jockey wheel. We want to make sure we completely miss the little tab that's inside the cage of the derailleur. Some people accidentally route the chain over it, and then you'll have a bunch of rubbing. So we want to miss that entire thing. So once we have that, the chain should smoothly pull through that derailleur jockey wheels. Alright, now to install the quick link, the easiest way to do this is to have both sides of the quick link at the ready. And we're going to simply take this chain and we're going to rotate it. We're going to pull it like a piece of floss around this cassette. And we're going to put this quick link at the top of the chain. Put it together. And we're going to keep a little bit of tension on that. And we're going to put this chain back into the chain ring. Like so. And then if we immobilize the front wheel and we put some tension on the cranks, it's going to pull that quick link tight. So here I'm going to zoom in and we can watch this quick link attach. Just like that. And that's it. Your chain is installed. Alright, last but not least, seat pad. We're going to take our seat pad with our Velcro. And you should have 4 pieces of sticky Velcro. I'm going to make sure they're kind of lined up nice on the, as even as we can on the cover. Now once you stick this stuff to the seat, it's pretty much there. So you only get one shot at this, so make sure it's in the position you want it in. So I always simply leave the Velcro on the cushion. I'm going to take off our little protectors, and I always do the base first. So just do the 2 on the base. Then we're going to line up that front of the seat cushion with the front of the seat. We're going to match the curvature. And then we're going to nice push down some pressure on that Velcro. And then we're going to repeat with the seat back. Now we have this little divot in the back for your kind of a nice little relief for your spine. So you can either tuck that Velcro down inside there, or you can cut it into 2 pieces. It's up to you. Alright, last but not least, make sure you check all your quick release levers, including this rear shock one, making sure it's nice and secure like that. We have secured our seat post and our seat skewers, and we're ready for a fit and for a test ride. Alright, congratulations, you have just built yourself a Q45 cruise bike. As always, check out our other videos for fit and adjustment. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at support@cruzbike.com, and thank you so much for watching.